Welcome to one of the most unsettling stories ever documented in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We're always curious to know where these accounts find their audience. In October 1904, the West Plains Gazette ran a small, forgettable notice saying the Howell County Jail would be closed for renovations. Nothing unusual, just a practical update about an aging building. The jail, a 3-story limestone structure built in 1883, had supposedly developed foundation issues from moisture, or so claimed County Commissioner Thomas Wilford. But what followed became one of the darkest, most whispered chapters in Ozark history. Buried in fragments and silence for over 50 years, the jail stood on the outskirts of West Plains, half hidden by old oak trees. From the main road, it looked like a modest 2-story building, but the ground sloped sharply behind it, concealing 2 lower levels built into the hill. Those subterranean floors stayed cool all year, something the county once praised for keeping inmates calm through the brutal Missouri summers. By 1904, 23 prisoners occupied the jail, mostly small-time offenders, serving short terms for theft, drunkenness, or unpaid debts. The design reflected late 19th century ideas about reform and control. The top floor held the sheriff's quarters and low-risk inmates awaiting trial. The middle level contained the main cell block built in a semicircle around a central guard post, a crude version of the panopticon design that let one man watch them all. The lowest level was different. Few official records mentioned it. It held isolation cells storage and a maze of narrow stone corridors carved directly into the bedrock. Local geologist Samuel Burnham once wrote that the jail had been built over an old cave system, sealed and expanded to form its foundation. That decision brought constant humidity, and during heavy rains, water would seep into the lower cells. Prisoners and guards alike suffered chronic coughs and fevers from the dampness. Sheriff Nathaniel Dawson kept detailed logs of every day, neat handwriting filling leather-bound ledgers with named sentences and behavior notes. On September 28, 1904, he wrote about an upcoming inspection by Mason James Harlow. The next day's entry was abrupt. All prisoners transferred to Springfield for temporary holding during repairs. And that was it. No list of inmates, no transport records, no signatures from Springfield authorities. Up to that point, Dawson's records had always been precise, every movement logged with time escort names and confirmation of arrival. Suddenly, that level of detail vanished. County financial records showed no payments for transportation or housing. The stableman's log said the prison wagon never left its shed. The railroad reported no prisoner transfers that week. 23 men gone without a trace, as if they'd been erased from existence. Local historian Margaret Evers stumbled onto the mystery in 1958 while researching the architectural history of Howell County. What started as a study of limestone construction turned into something far more chilling. While reviewing the county's 1904 jail renovation records, she noticed a glaring inconsistency. The Springfield Detention Center, the facility supposedly housing the transferred inmates, had no record of receiving prisoners from Howell County that fall. Even more troubling, Springfield's ledgers showed they were already overcrowded at the time, packed with railroad workers arrested during labor strikes. So where had the 23 Howell County inmates gone? Evers, a retired school teacher known for her precise, almost obsessive research habits, began to dig deeper. She cross-referenced county ledgers, census records, and public archives, searching for any trace of the missing men. But her findings were disturbing. None of the names listed as Howell County inmates in September 1904 ever appeared again in any official record, not in death certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, tax logs, or later census data. It was as if 23 men had been erased from existence. age when record-keeping was expanding rapidly across government offices, that kind of disappearance was nearly impossible. Evers concluded this wasn't bureaucratic neglect, it was deliberate removal. Her investigation eventually led her to an elderly woman named Eleanor Puit, who had worked as a cook at the jail from 1901 to 1905. At 84 years old, Puit's voice, captured on a fragile reel-to-reel tape now stored in the Missouri Historical Society archives, gave the first human glimpse into what really happened that autumn. "They brought in workers I'd never seen before," she said. "Not locals. Heard they came from St. Louis. Worked mostly at night. Sheriff Dawson told me to stay home for 2 weeks, said they were tearing into the walls that the dust would ruin the kitchen." When Puit returned, the building smelled different. "Like lime," she said softly, "and something else, something that made my throat close up." From then on, the jail was never the same. The guards who had once been loud and full of jokes grew quiet, withdrawn. Deputy Collins, a man who'd never touched liquor, started drinking heavily. "Said he couldn't sleep," Puit recalled. Sheriff Dawson locked himself in his office for hours, untouched meals left to spoil on his desk. The political landscape shifted soon after. County Commissioner Thomas Wilford, who authorized the renovation, was promoted to a state post, a rare leap for someone from a small Ozark county. Dawson abruptly resigned that December, citing health issues, though townsfolk later said he looked as strong as ever when he left for Arkansas. Within 6 months of the jail reopening, every official tied to the project was gone. Deputy Collins was found dead in the Current River that winter, his body frozen and bloated. The coroner called it an accidental drowning due to intoxication. But an unfiled report in the county archives noted he had no horse or wagon with him and was miles from home. 3 other guards also vanished from town under strange circumstances. One abandoned his family and disappeared west. Another took a logging job in Washington, despite having no experience. The third left behind his house fully furnished and a paycheck unclaimed at the courthouse. When Evers compared old and new photographs of the jail, the differences were subtle but significant. The post-renovation walls were noticeably thicker, the cells smaller by nearly 1.5 feet on each side. The stone used was different too, newer, smoother, and a shade lighter than the original limestone. In 1962, architectural inspectors found the new walls unusually dense, built without the hollow spaces typically used in masonry of that era. The most dramatic changes were underground. Entire corridors had been sealed off. The original 1883 blueprints showed 17 cells on the lowest level, connected by a winding passageway. The 1905 plans listed only 9 cells and a much simpler layout. No explanation was provided for the reduced capacity, especially odd given that overcrowding had supposedly prompted the renovation. One final clue appeared in the county expenditure logs: a payment to Harlow Stone and Masonry for over 1,000 pounds of quicklime, 80 bags of Portland cement, and a large quantity of sealing compound, far more than needed for structural repair. Among the listed materials were several items not typically used in masonry at all. Whatever happened in those weeks beneath the jail, it wasn't just renovation. It was concealment. Among the most disturbing discoveries in Margaret Evers' investigation were the contents of the jail's renovation supply orders. County purchase logs listed 25 pounds of laudanum, 18 leather restraints, and 6 full cases of chloroform, all filed under miscellaneous construction supplies and personally approved by Commissioner Thomas Wilford. No justification was given for why a structural project required powerful sedatives and restraints. Even stranger, the West Plains Gazette, usually diligent in reporting every cent of public spending, made no mention of the jail's renovation costs in its October or November 1904 issues. This omission stood out sharply against its exhaustive coverage of other county projects that same year, including a detailed breakdown of the courthouse clock tower repairs. When Evers sought the official financial records for the renovation, she found that the relevant pages had been neatly removed from the county ledger. The cuts were so precise they might have gone unnoticed if not for the sudden jump in page numbers. It was a surgical edit, intentional, deliberate, and silent. The local newspaper's editor at the time, William Schrader, was none other than Wilford's brother-in-law and a prominent figure in the West Plains Business Association. Meeting minutes from September 1904 mentioned a community improvement initiative requiring absolute discretion and unanimous support. No further explanation was given, but every member pledged secrecy until Commissioner Wilford deemed it appropriate to make details public. That disclosure, of course, never came. In the weeks following the so-called renovation, unsettling reports surfaced around town. A night watchman at the nearby mill told neighbors he heard what sounded like a woman's wailing coming from the direction of the jail, though he later blamed it on mountain lions. A local doctor was summoned twice to treat guards for unexplained fainting spells. Even stranger two stonemasons who had worked on the project abruptly left town without collecting their final wages, leaving behind personal belongings in their rented rooms. The town butcher Horatio Clean, whose shop stood directly across from the jail, kept a private journal that painted an even darker picture. The smell, he wrote, is unlike any I have encountered in my profession. It clings to clothing and hair and lingers long after washing. Sheriff Dawson insists it's lime and mortar, but I know otherwise. I keep my windows shut despite the autumn heat. Clean continued to document his unease over the following months. In November 1904, he wrote of the jail's weeping walls, describing how a reddish, oily substance would seep from the limestone whenever the air grew damp. Sheriff Dawson reportedly ordered the exterior whitewashed 3 separate times, but the stains returned within days. It begins as small, rust-colored spots, Clean wrote, spreading until the whole wall seems diseased. Churchgoers passing by complained about the smell, prompting Reverend Simmons to propose a blessing for the building. Dawson refused. Clean's final entry, dated February 1905, read, "Dawson is gone now. His replacement seems unaware of what transpired here. The walls have stopped their weeping with the winter frost. Perhaps spring will resurrect more than just the flowers. I am selling my shop. Some knowledge cannot be lived with." He left town a month later, relocating to Nebraska. His death certificate from 1917 lists the cause as melancholia leading to self-starvation, what would now be recognized as severe depression. More than half a century later, in 1961, geologist Dr. William Thornton conducted a material survey of historic Ozark structures, including the long-abandoned Howell County Jail. His report, circulated quietly among academic peers, noted that core samples taken from the building's interior walls contained organic residues inconsistent with standard limestone composition. Thornton's phrasing was cautious clinical, but his findings confirmed what many in West Plains had whispered for generations. Whatever had been sealed inside those walls in 1904 was never meant to be found. Dr. William Thornton's findings marked the most unsettling chapter of the Howell County Jail's dark legacy. While conducting his 1961 survey of historic Ozark structures, he discovered that between the layers of limestone and mortar in the old jail's walls was a substance he described as organic particulate matter, embedded directly in the concrete. He shipped samples to a laboratory in St. Louis for analysis, but the results were never released. Soon afterward, his research was abruptly discontinued. Thornton accepted a teaching position in California, leaving his Ozark survey unfinished. After his death in 1968, a journal was found among his possessions, its entries suggesting he had been deeply unsettled by what he uncovered. On November 18, 1961, he wrote, "The material appears to be oilous in nature. I've requested further analysis, but have been informed the samples were compromised during transit. This explanation is unsatisfactory given the preservation methods employed. Something about this situation feels deliberately obstructed." In another entry, he described calling Dr. Maheimer at the lab. The man, once known for his fearless work exhuming colonial cemeteries to study soil chemistry, was suddenly hesitant, telling Thornton only that some matters are better left to rest, and urging him to focus elsewhere. From that point forward, Thornton's notes detail escalating obstacles. His equipment failed repeatedly. Hotel rooms he'd booked were suddenly unavailable. Permits were revoked without explanation. Funding that had already been approved by his university was abruptly cut. In December 1961, he wrote, "I cannot escape the feeling that I am being deliberately impeded. Yesterday, I returned to my motel room to find my sample case open and several core sections missing, specifically those taken from the lower level of the jail. When he reported the theft, the local sheriff was dismissive until Thornton mentioned the nature of the samples, at which point his tone changed and he began asking pointed questions about who had commissioned the research. Thornton's final entry on the subject described a mysterious visitor at his motel. The man presented credentials from the State Historical Commission, but offered no name. He asked probing questions about sampling locations methodology and who Thornton had spoken to about his findings. His interest seemed less academic than cautionary, Thornton wrote. He mentioned that historical research can sometimes open doors best left closed, particularly in small communities with long memories. I've decided to conclude my work here earlier than planned." Thornton's widow later revealed that he refused to discuss his Ozark research for the rest of his life. He turned down invitations to return to Missouri, even for projects that could have advanced his career. At a 1965 geology conference, when West Plains was mentioned, he reportedly left the room abruptly and appeared visibly shaken for the remainder of the event. By then, the old jail was already a relic. It had remained in operation until 1927, when a new county facility was built near the courthouse. For the next 2 decades, the building served as a storage facility, a temporary flood shelter, and briefly as a cannery during wartime rationing. Workers consistently reported an oppressive atmosphere inside. Maintenance crews noted moisture seeping through the walls, despite repeated sealant applications and proposals to repurpose the structure into a community center in 1932 and a National Guard armory in 1941 were abandoned after preliminary assessments. The official reasons cited were the building's unsuitable configuration or persistent dampness. But one engineering report was more candid, noting an inexplicable resistance among workers to remain in the building after dusk. The caretaker from 1930 to 1939. Walter Simmons kept a meticulous log of maintenance issues and strange incidents. Pipes burst repeatedly, even after full replacements. Electrical systems failed during clear weather. Certain rooms experienced unexplained temperature drops, particularly on the lower levels. In a 1937 entry, he wrote, "Visitors to the upper floors report nothing unusual. Those who venture to the lowest level rarely return for a second visit. 4 different boiler room workers have abandoned the job rather than finish it forfeiting pay. They offer vague excuses about bad air or uneasy feelings. One man told me he felt watched by something hostile while working in the Northeast Corridor." A former night watchman, Edwin Hole, later gave a statement to the West Plains Historical Society in 1955. He'd worked at the jail between 1928 and 1931. "Those walls weren't right," Hall said. "Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like tapping from inside them, faint, like someone using the last of their strength. The first few times, I searched every room thinking an animal had gotten trapped somehow. His testimony would echo the unease first recorded by Horatio Clean and Margaret Evers. The sense that something had been sealed within the old Howell County Jail, and that even decades later, it was not entirely at rest. Edwin Holt never found anything, no matter how many times he searched. After a while, he told the West Plains Historical Society, "I just stopped doing rounds through the old cell blocks after midnight." He described one wall in particular, northeast corner, lowest level, that everyone avoided. Even drifters who broke in during winter refused to sleep near it. One stormy night, Holt saw something seeping through the mortar. It wasn't water, he said. It was darker, thicker, and smelled like the slaughterhouse outside town. He reported it to his supervisor, but by morning it had dried. The county sent a mason to inspect, but after one look, the man turned pale, walked out, and refused to come back even when offered double pay. His account wasn't unique. Historical Society archives preserve 3 other testimonies from people who worked in the building after it ceased being a jail. All described the same chilling details: walls that stayed unnaturally cold, faint sounds that seemed to come from inside the stone, and the feeling of being watched by something buried but not gone. Dorothy Welch, a clerk during the building's brief use as a wartime cannery in 1943, recounted one particular incident. A young worker named Timothy had been sent to organize crates near the old isolation cells. Moments later, he bolted upstairs, shaking and pale, insisting he'd heard voices whispering from the walls. Welch and several others went down with him, but they heard nothing. The next morning, Timothy was gone, left town without a word, his boarding room abandoned. That became a pattern. During the cannery's 6-month run, 7 workers assigned to the lower level quit without notice. The manager's closing report in December 1943 blandly cited atmospheric conditions unconducive to food processing and recommended demolition. No mention was made of the disappearances, the noises, or the smell. Then, in 1949, heavy rains caused part of the jail's northeast corner to collapse. For one brief moment, the truth nearly came to light. According to an early edition of the West Plains Daily Quill Workers, clearing debris found what appeared to be human remains embedded within the wall material. But the next day's issue replaced the story entirely with an article about local crop prices. When historian Margaret Evers later tried to locate police or coroner reports, she was told none existed. Only one piece of evidence survived: a photograph discovered years later in the belongings of Daily Quill reporter Samuel Kent after his sudden death in 1960. The faded image showed what looked like a human femur, half encased in concrete. Scrawled across the back in Kent's handwriting were 2 words: Howell Evidence. Kent's widow later told investigators her husband had been obsessed with the story before his death. He said it was going to be the story that defined the century, she recalled. In the weeks before his fatal heart attack, Kent had been interviewing an elderly man who claimed to have worked on the 1904 renovation as a young apprentice. Kent never revealed what the man said, only that it confirmed everything. That night, he locked his notes in his desk drawer, something he had never done before. The next morning, the drawer had been forced open, papers scattered. Kent swore nothing was missing, but 3 days later, he was dead of a heart attack at 47. His doctor, who had examined him 2 weeks earlier, said he was in perfect health. Kent's colleague photographer, Martin Delaney, later confirmed he had been with him when the remains were discovered. There was more than just that bone, Delaney said in a 1967 interview. When the wall came down, it revealed a cavity about the size of a man filled with organic material. The sheriff showed up before we could finish. He confiscated Sam's camera roll, but didn't realize Sam had already pocketed one frame. That's the photo you've seen. Delaney's voice reportedly shook when he described the position of the remains' arms extended upward, like whoever it was had been clawing to get out. Within hours, county officials cordoned off the site. A construction crew arrived that same night, working under floodlights until dawn. By morning, the damaged section had been removed, the wall rebuilt, and the debris hauled away. When Kent tried to track down the crew, he was told they'd been hired from Springfield and had already left town. 2 years later, in 1951, the county ordered the jail demolished, citing public safety concerns and structural instability. The rubble was buried in a quarry outside town. No further excavation was ever permitted. To this day, the official record lists the 1904 jail renovation as a routine maintenance project. But those who've read the surviving testimonies and seen Kent's photograph know better. Whatever was built into those walls was never meant to escape. The demolition of the Howell County Jail in 1951 was unlike any routine teardown. Instead of leaving the foundation in place, as was standard practice, the county ordered the entire structure obliterated down to 8 feet below ground. Workers were instructed to haul the debris to multiple disposal sites across the county rather than a single landfill. Once the site was cleared, 3 feet of fresh topsoil were laid down and oak seedlings planted effectively, erasing any trace of what had stood there. Today, the location appears as a quiet grove of trees with no plaque or marker to hint at its history. The demolition's foreman, Raymond Stokes, had lived in West Plains his entire life, but moved to Nebraska immediately after the job ended. According to family members, he refused to discuss the project except to remark cryptically, "Some things should stay buried, but that place won't rest easy, even under concrete." In a 1964 interview, his sister recalled his final words before leaving Missouri. "They found things in those walls that no Christian should have to see." County officials made the crew sign some kind of confidentiality agreement, highly unusual for a simple demolition job. Stokes, once known for his easygoing demeanor, reportedly grew withdrawn and melancholic after the job. In letters from Nebraska, he rarely mentioned West Plains at all, as if erasing it from his memory. Harlow Stone and Masonry. The same company responsible for both the 1904 renovation and the 1951 demolition dissolved soon after. Its records were supposedly destroyed in 1952 when a burst pipe flooded their storage facility. But in 1966, the daughter of the company's former business manager discovered duplicate ledgers he had kept at home. These books documented the disturbing details of both projects. The 1904 renovation ledger revealed unusually high wages for night work bonuses for workers who signed confidentiality agreements and payments to a local doctor for discretionary medical services. Most striking was a large transfer to Sheriff Dawson, labeled Administrative Facilitation Fee. The 1951 demolition records were just as revealing. Debris was sorted into 2 categories, standard and special handling required. Roughly 30% of the total material fell into the latter category and was hauled to multiple sites across the county: an abandoned mine shaft, a sinkhole on property owned by a county commissioner, and a freshly dug section of the municipal landfill. Each of these disposal sites was sealed under concrete caps, an unusual precaution for ordinary building waste. Then came the most damning piece of evidence. In 1962, Eleanor Puit's nephew unearthed a sealed mason jar in her garden after her death. Inside was a single folded diary page dated October 17, 1904. Her handwriting, shaky but legible, read, "They're sealing them in. God forgive us all. They're putting them right into the walls. I heard the screaming last night. Mr. Harlow said they'd run out of sedative. Sheriff said it doesn't matter. The new concrete will set quickly enough. 23 souls. I count them in my prayers, though I fear the Almighty has turned his face from this place. Mr. Wilford says it's for the greater good, that these men are diseased tissue that must be cut away. I've given my notice, but I'm told I must stay through month's end. May God have mercy on my cowardice." On the reverse side, dated October 18th, she wrote simply, "I cannot sleep." This fragment, hidden for nearly 6 decades, confirmed what locals had whispered and researchers had only suspected. The renovation of 1904 had not been about fixing a foundation. It had been about entombing living men inside the very walls of the Howell County Jail. And decades later, the building's demolition was less about safety and more about obliterating the evidence of what had been done there. The final pages of Eleanor Puig's hidden diary revealed the full horror of what had been done inside the Howell County Jail. Her last entries, dated October 18th and 19th, 1904, painted a picture of a woman consumed by fear and guilt, powerless to stop what she was witnessing. "The sounds from below are fewer now," she wrote. "Mr. Harlow says 10 walls are completed, 13 more to go. I saw them take Miller down yesterday. He was conscious enough to understand what was happening. The look in his eyes will haunt me until my dying day." They told his family he was transferred to Jefferson City. A letter with his signature arrived for his wife today. Sheriff had him sign it last week. How many other false letters will be delivered? How many families will spend years waiting for men who will never return? Her final entry, dated October 19th, read, "The Methodist minister came today asking after Cooper, who served as their groundskeeper before his arrest for drunkenness. Sheriff told him Cooper had been transferred due to his respiratory condition. The minister seemed satisfied, though Cooper's lungs were strong as an ox. I nearly spoke out then, but fear closed my throat. What kind of woman have I become to witness such things and remain silent? I will leave this place, but will God allow me to leave these memories behind? Some stains cannot be washed away." When Eleanor's nephew, Joseph Puig, discovered the diary fragment in 1962, he immediately brought it to the Howell County Historical Society. Rather than treat it as potential evidence, they dismissed it as the fantastical ramblings of an elderly woman. When Joseph persisted seeking handwriting analysis from an expert in Springfield, he reportedly received visits from several well-connected townsmen. They warned him that digging up old controversies could jeopardize his position at the lumber mill and his reputation in the community. Not long after the diary page vanished from his home, neighbors later recalled that Joseph became increasingly withdrawn, claiming he was being watched. In 1966, he sold his property and moved to Oregon. Before leaving, he confided in a close friend that he had made copies of the diary page and mailed them to people outside the county. "If anything happens to me," he said, "those papers will find their way to people who can't be silenced." No such copies have ever surfaced. Some believe he successfully safeguarded them, while others suspect they were intercepted long ago. But the final confirmation of the atrocity came not from Eleanor's writings, but from the words of the man who orchestrated it. In 1959, County Commissioner Thomas Wilford's personal correspondence was donated to the Missouri Historical Society by his granddaughter. Among hundreds of letters was a series of exchanges between Wilford Sheriff Nathaniel Dawson and State Senator Jameson that left no room for doubt. In an August 1904 letter to Senator Jameson, Wilford wrote, "The financial burden of maintaining these dregs of society has become untenable. Each costs the taxpayer nearly $200 annually, money that could rebuild our schools or improve our roads. We've developed an approach that will eliminate this burden entirely, while simultaneously strengthening the very institution designed to contain them." Ironic justice, one might say. A subsequent letter to Sheriff Dawson, written days before the so-called renovation began, was even more explicit. "The prisoners should be prepared as we discussed. Laudanum, in increasing doses over 3 days, should ensure minimal resistance when the time comes. Those with violent tendencies should receive additional sedation. Under no circumstances should any of them be permitted to communicate with outside parties during this period. As agreed, you will personally oversee the first phase to ensure Mason Harlow understands our requirements precisely. The final piece of correspondence, dated November 1904, was a cold acknowledgement of success. Our solution has proven even more economical than anticipated. The structure is indeed stronger. The problem cases permanently resolved and the ongoing expenses eliminated entirely. There were, I grant you, some unanticipated difficulties in the execution, primarily related to the final specimens who had developed tolerance to the sedative. Harlow assures me that any sounds which might have been detected during the process would have been attributed to the normal noises of construction. By spring, even the most sensitive nose will detect nothing unusual in passing the building. A year later, in December 1905, now comfortably established in Jefferson City, Wilford wrote one final note to an associate. The West Plains matter remained securely handled, and that was the last time anyone in authority mentioned the 23 men entombed within the walls of the Howell County Jail. The records were sealed, the structure destroyed, and the land replanted, leaving behind nothing but a silent grove of oak trees growing from soil that once held a secret too heavy for the living to bear. Wilford's final correspondence about the Howell County Jail, dated December 1905, carried the same cold precision that had defined the entire operation. Dawson's departure was regrettable, he wrote, but necessary given his increasing instability. His replacement appears suitably incurious about the previous administration's activities. I've ensured that all financial records have been appropriately adjusted and the relevant documentation secured in my private files. Time will complete our work burying memory, just as we buried the problem itself. That final line, burying memory, just as we buried the problem itself, became a chilling epilogue to what historians would later piece together as one of the most deliberate and organized mass murders in Missouri's history. A review of county court records from 1903 to 1904 revealed the mechanism that had fed the victims into Wilford's solution. Judge Henry Crawford, presiding over the Howell County Circuit Court at the time, had imposed unusually harsh sentences for trivial offenses. Men who might have served 30 days were suddenly given 6 months or a year. The result was a jail population bursting beyond capacity conditions the West Plains Gazette described as unhygienic and dangerous. Crawford's personal journal, discovered after his death in 1931, provided the missing link between the overcrowding and the massacre. In an entry dated July 1904, he wrote, "The severity serves a greater purpose. Wilford's solution, while extreme, will resolve several problems simultaneously. I find myself reluctant, yet convinced of its necessity. The community must be protected from these elements, and our resources directed toward worthier purposes." Within a year, Crawford had been appointed to the State Appeals Court, an astonishing leap for a small-town judge with no clear political connections. His journal contained notations beside certain defendants' names, cryptic marks that corresponded to powerful families in West Plains. Next to Jacob Miller, sentenced to 8 months for horse theft, was the name Wilford. Miller was the man Eleanor Puitt had mentioned seeing taken downstairs in her diary. Next to Thomas Cooper, 6 months for drunkenness, was the word Schroeder, the family of the town's newspaper editor. Cross-referencing these names with census data and court dockets revealed a pattern. Every inmate who disappeared during the renovation had in some way crossed paths with the county's elite. Some had threatened to expose business corruption. Others had romantic entanglements with the daughters of prominent citizens. A few had simply seen too much. They weren't criminals, they were liabilities. Even the medical records bore traces of the conspiracy. County physician Dr. Frederick Winters had certified 7 inmate deaths between January and September of 1904, all attributed to tuberculosis, a diagnosis inconsistent with any reported outbreak. No burial sites were ever listed for these men. In his official reports to the State Health Board, Winters made no mention of tuberculosis cases at all, though regulations required it. His personal ledger showed large purchases of quicklime and laudanum, both associated with mass burials and sedation. The amounts far exceeded what would be needed for ordinary medical work. Dr. Winters fled West Plains in early 1905, leaving behind unpaid debts, incomplete patient records, and a practice in disarray. A colleague who later took over his office wrote in a letter to the State Medical Association that Winters had appeared profoundly disturbed in his final weeks, self-medicating with whiskey, and speaking of unforgivable sins committed in service to the community. The most damning discovery came 60 years later, in 1964, when workers laying a new water main near the old jail site unearthed a leather satchel buried deep in the soil. Inside were papers badly degraded by moisture, but still partially legible. They appeared to be Sheriff Dawson's private records notes, never meant for official eyes. Among them were lists of names, dollar amounts, and signatures. Each entry corresponded to a prominent citizen or family, followed by the phrase, "permanent inmate removal." Payments ranged from $50 to $200, sometimes accompanied by short remarks like, "resolved as agreed" or confirmed, "no further correspondence." Those papers disappeared soon after being turned over to county authorities. Only a few photocopies survived, preserved by a construction foreman who, according to his family, didn't trust the look on the sheriff's face when he handed them over. Those copies confirmed what Margaret Evers and every researcher since had come to suspect: the 1904 Howell County Jail renovation was not a repair project. It was a systematic purge, one conceived by the county's leadership, executed by its law enforcement, and entombed beneath its very foundation. And though the jail is gone, replaced by an unmarked grove of oaks, the ground itself has never quite settled. Locals still say that after heavy rain, the earth gives off a faint acrid scent, like wet stone, and something else older and far more human. The contents of Sheriff Dawson's unearthed satchel left no ambiguity about what had taken place beneath the Howell County Jail in 1904. The papers, mottled with moisture but still legible in parts, detailed a financial and logistical network of quiet murder, a partnership between power and silence. Payments from prominent families and business interests coincided exactly with the disappearance of 23 men whose only crime had been defiance, indiscretion, or inconvenient knowledge. These were not hardened criminals, but men who had embarrassed the county's elite fathered illegitimate children with their daughters, uncovered business fraud, or tried to organize labor among the mining communities. Each represented a loose thread that, if pulled, could unravel the carefully woven hierarchy of Howell County. Among the satchel's contents was a rough sketch of the jail's floor plan, marked with numbers and initials. Notes in Dawson's hand indicated where specific prisoners were to be entombed. One notation read, "Troublemakers near ventilation channels to ensure expedited completion of process." Another document, more chilling still, was a chart listing inmates alongside observations about their physical condition and suitability for incorporation. Some were labeled, "Strong Constitution, requires additional preparation." Others, "Weakened by illness, ideal candidate." Each name was followed by an estimated completion time ranging from 4 to 6 hours to 2-3 days, depending on the wall's thickness and air exposure. The workers who found the satchel in 1964 turned it over to their foreman, who immediately contacted the county sheriff. Witnesses later said the sheriff arrived in person, promising that the find would be handled with the seriousness it deserved. No official record of the discovery was ever filed. When questioned months later, the sheriff claimed the papers had been too water-damaged to read and were discarded as historically worthless. But at least one worker had seen the contents before they disappeared. In 1965, he gave a statement to a Springfield reporter named Thomas Lane, describing pages listing payments between $50 and $500 beside inmate names and instructions for mixing concrete with other materials to minimize odor and ensure fast setting. Lane's editor pulled the story hours before publication, reportedly after a phone call from a state official. Soon after, the worker was dismissed from his job. When Lane tried to pursue the investigation independently, he found doors closing all around him. Sources refused to speak, records became inaccessible, and within 3 months, he was reassigned to the agricultural beat. His investigative career abruptly ended. Even through the damage, Dawson's own words survived in fragments. The surviving pages of his personal journal recorded the events in a tone devoid of remorse, a bureaucrat's ledger of horror. One entry dated October 5, 1904 read, "Miller lasted nearly 30 hours. Could hear him through the wall until early this morning. Harlow says next time we should position them differently to prevent sound carrying. Men complain about working conditions, doubled their pay today and provided whiskey. Even so, 2 refused to continue and had to be threatened with arrest." This business is more difficult than Wilford suggested. Another partially legible described the final moments of Thomas Cooper. Cooper knew what was happening when they brought him down. Fought like a wildcat despite the laudanum. Took 4 men to hold him while the forms were positioned. Harlow insists the remaining walls be poured at night, says the screams echo too much in daylight. Can't risk being heard from the road. The last intact entry, dated October 12, 1904, was chilling in its simplicity. It is finished. 23 problems permanently solved. Harlow has sealed the records in the north wall as instructed. God may judge us, but the town will thank us, even if they never know what was done on their behalf. By the time the satchel surfaced, almost everyone connected to the events was long dead. The secret might have faded entirely were it not for Jonathan Keyes, a University of Missouri graduate student studying Ozark architecture. In 1967, Keyes completed a master's thesis titled "Structural Adaptations in Rural Correctional Facilities, the Howell County Case Study." It was accepted by the university, but never published. The thesis was later reported missing from the archives, with library officials insisting it had never existed. Keyes' private research notes, recovered decades later by a colleague, revealed that he had spent 2 years interviewing elderly residents, cross-referencing local archives and analyzing photographs of the demolished jail. He traced one surviving witness, a retired mason, who had apprenticed under contractor James Harlow, the man who oversaw the 1904 renovation. The old mason, speaking only on the condition of anonymity, confirmed what every rumor had whispered for generations. They built forms around them, he told Keyes. The men were sedated, not dead. You could hear them breathing when we poured the mix. Harlow knew exactly how thick the walls needed to be to hold them without cracking. The quicklime set the concrete faster and took care of the smell. We placed them so the weight was even. That's what kept the walls standing so long. Keyes included this statement in his research notes, along with sketches based on the mason's recollections. He concluded that the Howell County Jail's renovation had been engineered with chilling precision, a fusion of architectural ingenuity and moral depravity. The victims were not buried beneath the structure. They were the structure. The last verifiable record of Jonathan Keyes appeared in 1968 when he requested copies of county blueprints from the Missouri Department of Corrections. After that, his correspondence ceased. He never defended his doctoral dissertation, and his name quietly disappeared from university directories. The oak grove that now covers the site remains undisturbed, a place where the ground itself seems to hold its breath. Those who visit say that in late autumn, when the air is still and the earth is damp, you can feel a faint vibration beneath your feet, rhythmic and irregular, like the heartbeat of something buried alive. It was murder performed like architecture. That's how Jonathan Keyes recorded it after his 1967 interview with a retired mason. The old man described the process without shame, as if explaining a routine construction job. Prisoners sedated with laudanum, placed upright in wooden forms, their limbs arranged to create uniform density within the walls. Arms were often extended upward, not in mercy, but to save space and make the poor structurally sound. The first layer of concrete was poured up to their shoulders. Once partially set, a second layer covered them entirely. Air channels were sometimes built in not to prolong life, but to accelerate decomposition by feeding microbial activity with oxygen. What haunts me most, Keyes wrote in his research journal, is not just the cruelty, but the casual way it was described. He spoke as if installing windows or pouring a footing. He grumbled about Harlow's early mistakes, the inefficiency, the mess, the wasted quicklime, like an engineer perfecting a process, not a man recounting mass murder. The mason explained how Harlow refined the technique, with each successive wall making it faster, quieter, and easier to conceal. Then, in 1968, Jonathan Keyes himself vanished. His car was found near the old jail site doors, unlocked, no sign of struggle. His research materials, field notes, interviews, photographs were missing. The official investigation wrote him off as a student who'd cracked under pressure, citing unpaid loans and a recent breakup as reasons he might have left. His family rejected the explanation, pointing out his meticulous character and strong ties to the university. Keyes' advisor, Professor Alan Thornhill, fought to retrieve his student's work. In an October 1968 letter to the university administration, he wrote, "I have been unable to retrieve Jonathan's thesis from the department archives, despite personally submitting it months ago. The librarian insists no such document was ever processed. His research notes, which filled 2 large filing cabinets in our shared office, have also vanished." Individuals in West Plains who spoke with him now deny ever meeting him or claim he misunderstood them. This goes beyond normal academic disagreement into something orchestrated. Thornhill's concerns were dismissed as speculation. Soon after his tenure review was delayed, his funding cut, and his career nudged into safer topics. In a 1970 private letter to a colleague, he wrote, "Some doors once opened cannot be closed without crushing whatever stands in the threshold." I fear Jonathan may have been such a casualty. The last known reference to the Howell County Jail massacre came from historian Margaret Evers. In a letter she wrote shortly before her death in Harris in 1969, to a colleague at the Smithsonian Institution, she confessed her despair. "They've built a wall of silence as impenetrable as those that entombed those poor souls. Local records disappear. Witnesses recant their testimonies. Colleagues suddenly lose interest in a story that should horrify any human conscience. I've come to believe the descendants of those responsible remain determined to keep this buried." Perhaps that's fitting. We are all still imprisoned by what happened in that place. Her closing paragraphs were as much a warning as a lament. What troubles me most is not just the act itself, horrific as it was, but the community's complicity in its concealment. Generation after generation has maintained this silence. Children and grandchildren of the perpetrators now sit on the very boards and commissions that control access to the evidence. The jail may be gone, but its shadow still darkens every aspect of life in West Plains. How many other such secrets lie buried in small towns across America, protected by time and the instinct for self-preservation? If you choose to pursue this matter after my death, and I hope someone will proceed with extreme caution. 3 researchers before me have met with unfortunate accidents or sudden changes in career trajectory. My own home has been entered twice in the past month, though nothing of value was taken. Ever's letter is the last surviving document connecting the threads. After her death, her papers were transferred to a regional archive. Portions of her research have since disappeared. Jonathan Key's thesis has never been located. The satchel's contents were never entered into evidence. And today, the old jail site remains what it was designed to be, a grove of oak trees, quiet and unremarkable, hiding its secret in plain sight. Margaret Ever's final letter ended with a grim promise and an even grimmer silence. Only my notes on the jail were disturbed, she wrote. I've taken precautions with the most damning evidence, arranging for it to be held by a trusted friend who will know when and how to release it. Perhaps someday, when those with family connections to these events no longer wield power in Howell County, the full story can finally be told. That day never came. When her personal papers were donated to the Missouri Historical Society after her death, archivists found conspicuous gaps in her research timeline. Entire months were missing from her journals and all material related to the Howell County Jail. 3 notebooks and a photograph album mentioned in her correspondence had vanished. The accompanying inventory noted that certain materials deemed of questionable historical validity have been excluded from the collection by the executor of the estate. That executor was her nephew, recently appointed as a circuit judge in Howell County. In the years after the jail's demolition, its remnants did not disappear. They were scattered. Foundation stones were repurposed throughout West Plains. Some became part of the retaining wall behind the new courthouse. Others were used to line the garden path of the First Methodist Church. Many were sold at a county auction in 1952 and ended up in private homes, fireplaces, and storefronts. The people who bought them had no idea what they were bringing into their walls. A retired stonecutter named Walter Grimes told a local history enthusiast in 1963 about his work processing those materials. Those stones weren't right, he said. When we cut them, sometimes we'd find dark streaks or cavities filled with what looked like ash. They gave off a smell, especially when wet. Most peculiar stone I ever worked with in 50 years. Grimes explained that foremen instructed workers to discard any blocks with strange inclusions, but there were so many that they began simply turning them inward, hiding the marks within the construction. One block we split, he said, had something inside. I'll never forget a bit of bone, small but unmistakable. Looked like a finger joint. The foreman took it and told us to forget what we'd seen. After that, we stopped cutting altogether. We used the stones whole, and no one argued. County maintenance records from the 1950s tell a quieter but equally unsettling story. Between 1953 and 1957, 7 different homeowners reported strange problems with their fireplaces, each built from stone salvaged from the jail. Inspectors documented smoke of unusual odor, faintly sweet, leaving an oily residue. In every case, the chimneys were eventually sealed or dismantled. One of those homeowners, Abigail Winters, wrote to a friend in 1955, describing her experience. The smell was unlike anything I can describe. Not quite rotting meat, not quite burning hair, but somehow both. It filled the house within minutes and lingered for days. The children had nightmares the whole week it lasted. When our minister came to bless the house, he refused to stay until the fire was out. My husband removed the chimney afterward. The mason who replaced it found something in the stones. He wouldn't say what, but he refused payment and left without a word. In West Plains and the surrounding Ozark Hills, the memory of 1904 has never entirely faded. Locals speak of it in whispers or not at all. The families who profited from the disappearance of those 23 men remain fixtures in the county's power structure: judges, commissioners, business owners, church elders. The ground where the jail once stood remains undeveloped, overgrown with oak trees planted after the demolition. Visitors describe an unnatural hush there, a sense that the air is waiting, listening. Every attempt to build on that land has failed. In 1972, a proposal to construct a community center on the site was rejected by unanimous vote of the county commission, despite broad public support. Commissioner Harold Wilford, grandson of Thomas Wilford, cited unsuitable soil conditions, though no geological survey had been performed. Similar proposals in 1986, 1994, and 2003 all met the same fate. Each time the reasons varied: environmental impact, historical preservation, zoning complications, but the decision-makers were always the same bloodlines. Wilford Schrader Crawford. Over a century after the Howell County Jail was reduced to rubble, its story remains buried beneath that quiet grove of trees. The stones that once sealed the screams of 23 men now lie scattered through churches, courthouses, and hearths across West Plains. Reminders perhaps that some walls were never meant to come down. None of the official records ever acknowledged the true history of the Howell County Jail, but those who had inherited its secret seemed determined to keep the ground undisturbed. Local meetings about the property never mentioned its past, yet longtime residents noticed that certain officials, those in the know, were adamant that the land remain untouched. Over the years, any attempt to uncover the truth has met with vanishing documents, corrupted archives, and missing files. Even digital newspaper scans from 1904 show inexplicable gaps in specific date ranges. Researchers who've tried to dig deeper often find their access revoked or their correspondence ignored. In 1957, an Ozark folklorist collecting local legends recorded a conversation with an elderly Howell County resident. When asked why people avoided building with old limestone, the man replied, "Not since the trouble at the county jail. They say those walls absorb the suffering of the men they put inside them. Stone has memory, you know. It holds on to things. You use a man's misery as your building material. It seeps into your home bit by bit, year by year." When pressed for more detail, the old man became agitated. "Some stories aren't meant to be remembered," he said. "Some memories are poison. You don't bottle them up for the next generation to swallow. That superstition lingers even today." In West Plains, parents once warned misbehaving children that the old jail walls still have room for one more. Older locals sometimes describe cruel or vengeful acts as jail justice, though few will explain where the phrase comes from. In 1998, a high school history teacher tried to include the jail story in her curriculum, presenting it as an unresolved local mystery. The school board rejected her proposal, calling it potentially disruptive to community relations. When she persisted, citing academic freedom, her contract was quietly not renewed the following year. The suppression extended even to science. In 1961, geologist Dr. William Thornton's core samples from the old jail had already raised suspicions. But years later, in 1966, laboratory records leaked by a former technician revealed what the official reports had concealed: the material contained human bone fragments and traces of soft tissue. The technician swore under oath that the remains showed signs of life at the time of entombment. Microscopic analysis revealed cellular reactions consistent with live tissue exposed to setting concrete proof that the victims had been alive as the walls hardened around them. Soon after, the samples and full report were seized by men claiming to represent the Missouri State Historical Preservation Office, an organization that, according to state records, did not exist in 1966. The technician who had performed the tests was transferred to another lab, and when contacted years later, denied any involvement. He claimed never to have worked with samples from Howell County and dismissed his sworn statement as a forgery. The attorney who had collected his testimony, Vernon Hayes, refused to drop the matter. His private files, examined after his death in 1978, revealed correspondence with researchers across the Ozarks. Hayes had uncovered rumors of similar renovations in at least 3 other Missouri counties during the early 1900s, each involving the disappearance of undesirable men and construction projects overseen by the same network of businessmen and local officials that operated in West Plains. Hayes intended to compile his findings into a book titled Buried Justice: Institutional Murder in the Ozarks, but he never completed it. 2 weeks after meeting with a publisher, he was found dead in what authorities ruled a hunting accident. His manuscript was never located. In the Howell County Courthouse basement, an archival box labeled County Records 1900 to 1905 sits nearly empty. Inside is a single index card, browned and brittle, reading, "Materials temporarily removed for preservation purposes, 1962. The documents were never returned. The archivist who handled their removal, Harriet Winters, left behind a private journal discovered after her death in 1966. Her entry about that day reads, "The men who came for the records carried credentials I did not recognize. When I questioned the removal of entire years of county files, they said it was part of a statewide preservation initiative. They promised the materials would be microfilmed and returned in 6 months. I asked for written authorization and received a hastily signed form bearing the county executive's name. Something about their manner unsettled me. I made my own list of what they took: Dawson's log books, Judge Crawford's sentencing records, and financial reports from 1903 to 1905, and placed it in my safe deposit box as insurance. No such list was ever found. Today, the grove of oaks still covers the site of the old jail. The soil there is quiet, the air heavy, the silence deep enough to feel. Generations have come and gone, but the ground remains untouched, protected not by law or faith, but by fear. In Howell County, memory is its own kind of prison, and the walls that once held the condemned still stand, even if only beneath the surface. Harriet Winters' safe deposit box, opened after her death, contained only family papers and a few pieces of heirloom jewelry. The bank manager confirmed that she had visited the box just 2 days before dying, implying she may have removed whatever she feared would vanish with her. 3 years later, another silence cracked. In 1969, Harold Winters, an aging mason who had once apprenticed under James Harlow, left a sealed confession with his attorney to be opened after his death. The statement was spare but devastating. The walls were 2 feet thick when finished. The men were placed inside the forms, still living, and the concrete poured around them. Quicklime was added to hasten decay and dull the smell. Some took hours to die, others days. We were told they were violent criminals bound for hanging. I have since learned this was not true. I have carried this knowledge like stones in my pockets, pulling me beneath dark water. May God forgive what we did in that place. Harold's letter contained construction details that matched the anomalies later documented by geologists and historians. How Harlow altered the standard wall design to accommodate human bodies without compromising load-bearing strength. How vertical rods were driven through the fresh concrete and through the men to prevent settling. How he timed each pour, recording how long the prisoners continued moving before the mix hardened. Harlow treated it like an equation, Winters wrote. He calculated death the way other men calculate weight and span. Soon after a St. Louis journalist examined the confession, it vanished from the attorney's files. The attorney suffered a massive stroke within a week and never spoke again. Only fragments of Rebecca Lawson's interview notes survive, quoting Winters' words nearly verbatim. Lawson tried to publish her expose in 1970, but every major outlet refused. One editor wrote that while her story was compelling, it lacked defensible documentation and could expose the paper to catastrophic liability. Refusing to yield, Lawson traced money transfers linking the old Howell County families to state institutions that had profited from prison labor contracts. In 1971, her apartment was broken into. Nothing of value was taken except her files, typewriter, and camera. The case went nowhere. The Howell County Jail endures not as a building, but as an idea, a blueprint of how ordinary men can design atrocity in plain sight. There are no hauntings, no restless spirits. The horror is purely human. It lies in the precision with which bureaucrats and craftsmen turned punishment into architecture, and in the quiet complicity that allowed it to remain hidden for generations. Professional historians still label the story a myth. They cite missing paperwork, conflicting accounts, the logistical improbability of mass murder within a public institution. Yet the pattern of absence records, erased witnesses, silenced evidence, lost forms its own kind of proof. What survives is a mosaic of fragments, each pointing to deliberate removal rather than chance decay. More than a century later, the oak trees over the old jail site grow tall and undisturbed. Their roots twist through imported soil toward foundations, long excavated, drawing strength from the same ground that once entombed 23 men. In the older houses of West Plains, some built with those recycled stones, residents still whisper about strange smells and damp weather, and fireplaces that will not draw right. They may not know the history, but the past seems to know them. When a developer proposed a small retail complex there in 2015, opposition rose swiftly. The objections cited soil stability and environmental impact, never history. Yet the project was abandoned without explanation. The land remains what the conspirators intended it to be, a quiet surface over buried truth, a place where prosperity and memory still cannot share the same ground. The grove remains untouched, a quiet patch of earth at the edge of West Plains, where sunlight filters through the oak canopy, falling on ground that refuses to yield. Despite its prime location near the town center, every effort to develop the land has failed. The official explanation, repeated like scripture, is soil instability, though no engineering report has ever been produced to support it. At the most recent public hearings, several speakers opposing the proposal were descendants of the very families tied to the 1904 events. A coincidence noted by one visiting journalist, but omitted entirely from local coverage. Teenagers from the high school sometimes test their courage by visiting the grove at night, especially around Halloween. They return with the same stories every year. The strange stillness beneath the trees, the way sound seems to die before reaching your ears, the prickling sense of being watched. The accounts are dismissed as adolescent imagination, yet the pattern never changes. In 2010, a psychology professor from the University of Missouri conducted an informal experiment bringing 30 students to the site without revealing its history. 60% reported unusual discomfort. Many used the same words: oppressive, watched, trapped. Control groups at other Ozark sites reported no such sensations. The limestone walls of the Howell County Jail are long gone, but fragments endure, scattered in retaining walls, church paths, and foundations across the town. And somewhere, perhaps in a courthouse basement or a sealed attic trunk, the last pieces of evidence still wait, sealed away like the truth itself pressing against the walls of time. When you pass an old stone wall in the Ozarks place your hand on its surface. Beneath the chill of limestone, beneath the centuries of sediment, there may be more than history trapped there. Stone, after all, has memory. It absorbs what happens around it, the heat of the sun, the weight of sorrow, the final vibrations of a dying heartbeat. Those who believed they could bury their crime in limestone were wrong. For over a century, the story of the Howell County Jail has emerged in fragments. Each researcher, each witness, each discovery, adding another shard to a shattered mosaic. The evidence now forms a picture too consistent to dismiss a conspiracy not only of murder, but of silence, one that spanned decades and reached into every level of the community. The true horror of West Plains is not merely that 23 men were entombed alive, but that an entire town built its identity atop the silence that followed. They constructed a second prison, one made of denial and complicity, and for generations, the community itself has been confined within it. Then in 2018, the silence finally cracked. Dorothy Wilford, great-granddaughter of Commissioner Thomas Wilford, contacted a historian at the University of Missouri. After a lifetime of secrecy, she had chosen confession over inheritance. She handed over a collection of family papers records, preserved for more than a century despite their damning contents. Among them was Thomas Wilford's personal journal, a meticulous record of the planning and execution of what he called the permanent solution. The entries detailed meetings between Wilford Judge Henry Crawford Sheriff Nathaniel Dawson and Mason James Harlow. Together they drafted what they described as a final measure to address the financial and social burdens posed by the jail's inmates. Wilford's calculations were chilling in their precision, a cost-benefit analysis comparing the annual expense of housing prisoners to the one-time cost of incorporation. He even noted an unspoken deterrent effect, a warning to those who might later challenge authority, though he acknowledged it could never be mentioned publicly. The journal also named their collaborators: the town doctor who supplied sedatives, the newspaper editor who managed the narrative, the telegraph operator who intercepted outgoing messages, and several businessmen who funded the renovation. Each had a stake in maintaining silence. Each profited from erasing those 23 men from existence. 3 weeks after turning over the documents, Dorothy Wilford took her own life with an overdose of sleeping pills. Her note contained just one line: "Some burdens cannot be passed to another generation. May God forgive what my family has done." The materials were authenticated by independent experts and now reside in the Missouri State Archives. With their release, the legend of the Howell County Jail transformed into fact. For the first time in more than 100 years, the victims' names were restored to history. Jacob Miller, Thomas Cooper, Franklin, Ellis, William Parker, Joseph Donovan, Charles Thompson, Henry Washington, Samuel Green, David Martinez, Michael, Ayor, Patrick Callahan, Robert Johnson, James Williams, John Smith, Daniel Brown, Edward Davis, George Wilson, Harold Thompson, Richard Lee, Benjamin Adams, Frederick Jackson, Thomas Murphy, and Peter Kovetz. They were ordinary men. Some drifters, some locals punished for small offenses, silenced because they were inconvenient. Their final moments came not in defiance, but in confusion and terror as concrete closed around them and the air grew thin. The story of the Howell County Jail endures as more than a tale of local corruption. It is a mirror held up to every community that prizes reputation over justice, wealth over mercy, silence over truth. It reminds us that the most monstrous acts rarely come from madmen, but from the ordinary, the dutiful, the loyal, the obedient, those who convince themselves that cruelty serves a greater good. The oak grove still stands where the jail once stood. The roots dig deep, entwining with what remains beneath. The limestone, the soil, the memory, it all endures. The mortar of silence that held the truth together for over a century has finally begun to crumble. And beneath it, the voices of the lost have begun at last to be heard.